On the morning of January 24th, 41 AD, Rome plunged into chaos. The Emperor Caligula had been attending theatrical games in the Palatine Hill complex. As he walked through a narrow corridor leading to the palace, members of his own Praetorian Guard surrounded him. Cassius Chaerea, the guard's tribune whom Caligula had publicly mocked for his effeminate voice, delivered the first sword blow. Other guards joined in, stabbing Caligula more than 30 times. The assassins then ran through the palace, killing Caligula's wife Caesonia and smashing his infant daughter's head against a wall. While the Senate gathered in the capital preparing to restore the Republic and divide power among themselves, one man was hiding in the palace. Claudius, Caligula's 50-year-old uncle, had fled to an apartment near the palace guardroom. When a soldier named Gratus entered and saw feet sticking out from behind a curtain, he pulled the fabric aside and discovered Claudius trembling with fear. Claudius expected to be killed. Instead, Gratus recognized him as the brother of the legendary Germanicus and the last surviving adult male of the imperial family. The soldier held Claudius to his feet and proclaimed him emperor on the spot. Within hours, the entire Praetorian Guard had pledged their loyalty. The news sent shockwaves through Rome's elite. Claudius was the family embarrassment, a man whose pronounced stammer, chronic illness, and limp had made him the butt of jokes for decades. Emperor Augustus had barred him from political office, saying he was unfit to represent the imperial house. Tiberius had isolated Claudius on Capri, where he spent his time with scholars and slaves. Caligula had humiliated him at public banquets, mocking his disabilities for entertainment. While his relatives commanded armies and governed provinces, Claudius had devoted himself to writing history. He completed a 41-book history of Augustus's reign, wrote 8 books on Etruscan history, and compiled a dictionary. He surrounded himself with intelligent freedmen, learning how administration worked from the bottom up. These slave-born bureaucrats would become the backbone of his government. Yet this man, dismissed as a fool, would rule Rome for 13 years. He would personally lead the conquest of Britain, crossing the Channel with war elephants to accept the surrender of British kings. He would reorganize the imperial bureaucracy, elevating capable freedmen like Narcissus and Pallas to positions of unprecedented power. He would survive multiple conspiracies and assassination attempts, proving far more politically astute than anyone had anticipated. His reign would also expose his greatest vulnerability, misplaced trust. His third wife Messalina would commit bigamy, publicly marrying her lover while Claudius was away at Ostia. His fourth wife, Agrippina, his own niece, would poison him with a dish of mushrooms to secure the throne for her son Nero. This is the story of how a man Rome never wanted became an emperor they could not ignore, how Claudius the scholar became Claudius the conqueror, and how the survivor of decades of ridicule finally fell to those he trusted most. Part 1. The Mocked Prince. Tiberius Claudius Drusus entered the world on August 1, 10 BC, in the Gallic city of Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon. His father, Nero Claudius Drusus, was a celebrated general and stepson of Emperor Augustus. His mother, Antonia Minor, was the daughter of Mark Antony and niece of Augustus herself. The birth should have been cause for celebration, but within months, the infant displayed signs that something was wrong. His head trembled constantly, his legs buckled when he tried to stand. As he grew, his speech emerged slow and halting, each word fighting its way past a stubborn stammer. The imperial family, obsessed with physical perfection and dignitas, saw not a prince, but a problem. His father died on campaign when Claudius was barely 1 year old, leaving Antonia to raise him and his older brother Germanicus alone. While Germanicus grew into the golden boy of the dynasty, handsome and charismatic, Claudius became the family secret. Augustus, the aging emperor, could not bear the sight of his great-nephew's contortions. He wrote privately that Claudius seemed deficient in mind as well as body, unfit for any role in public life. The emperor banned Claudius from appearing at official functions. When relatives visited the palace, Claudius was often hidden away. His grandmother Livia, wife of Augustus and the true power behind the throne, treated Claudius with cold disregard. She had engineered her own son Tiberius into the succession and saw no value in a disabled grandson. Antonia, more sympathetic, hired tutors and doctors, but even she accepted the verdict of the family. She called Claudius a monstrosity of a human being, a phrase that stung deeply enough that Claudius would remember it decades later. Denied the military career that defined Roman manhood, Claudius turned to books. At age 10, he began studying with the historian Livy, who encouraged his interest in the past. While his peers drilled with wooden swords, Claudius read. He learned Greek and Latin rhetoric, though his stammer prevented him from delivering speeches. He studied law, not to practice in the courts, but to understand the machinery of Roman power. By his early 20s, he had decided that if Rome would not let him serve in the traditional way, he would serve through scholarship. In 20 AD, Claudius's brother Germanicus died in Syria under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned on orders of Tiberius. The loss devastated Antonia and removed Claudius's most powerful protector. 2 years later, Augustus died and Tiberius became emperor. Any hope that Tiberius might show kindness to his nephew vanished quickly. Tiberius saw Claudius as a potential rival, however unlikely, and kept him under constant watch. He denied Claudius any political office, no matter how minor. When a vacancy opened for the position of quaestor, a standard first step for men of Claudius's rank, Tiberius passed him over. Instead, Tiberius assigned Claudius to the imperial household on Capri, effectively isolating him from Rome and its politics. There, Claudius spent his days with the one group of people who showed him genuine respect, the household slaves and freedmen who actually ran the empire's day-to-day administration. He befriended men like Narcissus, a freedman who managed correspondence, and Pallas, who oversaw accounts. Claudius learned how the imperial bureaucracy functioned from the ground up. He saw how petitions were processed, how tax revenues flowed, how the emperor's will was translated into action. This education in practical governance would prove more valuable than any military command. During these years, Claudius produced an astonishing body of work. He wrote 41 books on the history of Augustus's reign, drawing on documents from the imperial archives. He completed 20 books on the history of the Etruscans, an ancient people whose language he helped decipher. He wrote a defense of Cicero after the orator had fallen from favor, and compiled a dictionary of the Latin language. None of these works survive today, but later historians quote them extensively, suggesting they were meticulously researched and carefully written. The man Rome, mocked as a fool, was quietly becoming its most knowledgeable historian. Claudius also married during this period. His first wife, Plautia Urgulanilla, was the granddaughter of a close friend of Augustus. The marriage produced 2 children but ended in divorce when Claudius accused her of scandalous behavior. His second wife, Aelia Paetina, was a relative of the Praetorian prefect Sejanus, and that marriage too ended in divorce when Sejanus fell from power. These marriages were arranged for political convenience, but Claudius's disabilities and lack of prospects meant he could command only marginal brides. March 16, 37 AD, brought a sudden shift. Tiberius died, possibly smothered on orders of the Praetorian prefect Macro. The throne passed to Caligula, Claudius's nephew and Germanicus's son. Caligula was 24, Claudius was 46. The new emperor had grown up watching his uncle humiliated, and he continued the family tradition of mockery. At public banquets, Caligula would toss Claudius handfuls of bones and laugh as he scrambled for them like a dog. He appointed Claudius to his first real position as a consul, but paired him with a man who would do all the actual work. Caligula took special pleasure in forcing Claudius to preside over legal cases and then interrupting his stammering pronouncements with jokes. Yet Caligula also protected Claudius in his own twisted way. He executed potential rivals without hesitation, but Claudius was never a threat. In 40 AD, during a mock naval battle on Lake Fucinus, Caligula grew tired of Claudius's presence and ordered his guards to throw him into the river. Claudius spluttered to shore downstream, soaked and humiliated. It was the sort of treatment that passed for affection in the imperial family. Claudius survived by perfecting the art of invisibility. He attended the palace daily, nodded at the right moments, and never contradicted the emperor. He spent his evenings with his books and his freedman friends, learning even more about provincial administration and tax law. He made sure to be visibly loyal but politically irrelevant. While senators and courtiers scrambled for Caligula's favor and died for it, Claudius remained in his corner, stammering through dinner parties and writing chapters no one read. On January 24, 41 AD, Claudius attended the day's theatrical games with Caligula as required. When the emperor decided to return to the palace for lunch, Claudius stayed behind in the stands, perhaps relieved for a few hours away from his nephew's cruelty. He heard the shouts first, then the screams. Running toward the palace, he saw Caligula's body lying in the corridor, surrounded by guards. He turned and fled back into the palace complex, seeking any hiding place. He found an apartment near the Praetorian barracks and ducked behind a curtain, pressing himself against the wall. For the next 3 hours, chaos consumed Rome. The assassins, led by the tribune Cassius Chaerea, rampaged through the palace, killing anyone connected to the imperial family. They found Caligula's wife Caesonia and stabbed her to death. They killed his infant daughter Julia Drusilla, smashing her skull against a wall. In the Senate, some men spoke openly of restoring the Republic. Others simply wanted to survive. Claudius heard the boots in the hallway. A soldier entered, perhaps searching for valuables, perhaps looking for survivors. He saw the curtain move and yanked it aside. There stood Claudius, trembling, his stammer preventing him from even begging for mercy. The soldier, Gratus by name, recognized the man behind the trembling form. Without consulting his superiors, Gratus made a decision that would change history. He helped Claudius to his feet, called for his comrades, and declared that the Praetorian Guard had an emperor. The other guards arrived quickly. They looked at Claudius, this 50-year-old man they had mocked for decades, and saw opportunity. With Caligula dead and no clear successor, their own future was uncertain. An emperor who owed them his life, who had no military support and no political base, was exactly what they needed. They formed a protective circle around Claudius and proclaimed him emperor on the spot. For the first time in his life, Claudius's survival depended on standing in the open, with Rome's most dangerous soldiers at his back. Within an hour, the Senate received word that the Praetorian Guard had chosen an emperor. The senators, gathered in the Capitol and debating the future of the empire, were stunned. Claudius? The fool? The family embarrassment? Some senators prepared to fight, others simply laughed. But the Guard had made their choice, and in Roman politics, 3,000 armed men in the capital could make reality out of any fiction. The man who had spent his life in the shadows was about to step into the light. Part 2. The Soldier's Emperor. The Praetorian Guardsmen moved Claudius quickly through the palace corridors, their boots echoing off marble floors still stained with Caligula's blood. They took him to their own fortified camp on the Viminal Hill, where 3,000 armed men could guarantee his safety. Claudius, accustomed to mockery and dismissal, found himself suddenly surrounded by deferential soldiers who addressed him as Caesar. He could not quite believe the transformation. Within the camp walls, the prefects Callistus and Rufrius Pollio presented him to the assembled troops. The soldiers pressed forward, reaching out to touch his toga, shouting their allegiance. For the first time in his life, Claudius was not the object of ridicule, but the center of power. The Senate, meeting in emergency session on the Capitoline Hill, received the news with disbelief and fury. Many senators had been complicit in Caligula's assassination, either through direct participation or quiet approval. They saw the killing as a necessary correction to imperial excess and dreamed of restoring the old republic, where power flowed from the Senate and people of Rome, not from soldiers and tyrants. Now the Praetorian Guard had short-circuited their plans by installing a new emperor without their consent. Some senators advocated immediate resistance. Lucius Annius Vinicianus argued that they should declare the Guard's action illegal and rally the urban cohorts against them. Others, more cautious, pointed out that without an emperor, Rome would descend into civil war, and the Senate lacked the military strength to enforce its will. While the Senate debated, the Praetorian Guard solidified their position. They controlled the city walls, the armories, and the treasury. Their prefects met with Claudius in the camp commander's quarters, explaining the realities of his new position. He was emperor because they said so. Their loyalty came at a price. Claudius listened carefully, his stammer preventing quick replies but not quick comprehension. He understood that these men needed him as much as he needed them. A new emperor from outside the dynasty might appoint his own guard commanders, leaving them stripped of power or even executed. Claudius offered them legitimacy. They offered him protection. It was a business transaction masquerading as an act of loyalty. Into this tense standoff stepped a surprising mediator, Herod Agrippa, king of Judea and a close friend of Claudius. Agrippa had been in Rome since Caligula's death and knew both the Senate and the imperial household intimately. He had grown up with Claudius on the Palatine Hill, one of the few people who had always treated the stammering scholar with genuine affection. Agrippa first approached the Senate, appealing to their pragmatism. He reminded them that Claudius was, after all, the brother of Germanicus, the most popular man in Roman memory. He pointed out that resistance would mean bloodshed in the streets and probable defeat. Then Agrippa went to the Praetorian camp, where he found Claudius in conference with his new military protectors. He urged his friend to show magnanimity, to forgive the Senate's initial resistance, and offer them a role in the new government. Claudius, with Agrippa at his side, agreed to address the Senate personally. On January 25, 41 AD, he walked from the Praetorian camp to the Senate house, surrounded by armed guards. The senators watched him enter, this man they had dismissed for decades. They expected a fumbling, incoherent speech that would confirm their worst fears about his incompetence. Instead, Claudius delivered a carefully prepared oration that demonstrated the full power of the education they had denied him value for. He spoke of continuity and stability. He acknowledged the Senate's importance. He promised to share power, to restore the old forms of government, to rule as a first among equals. The speech lasted more than an hour. Senators later reported that while his delivery remained halting, the content was masterful. He referenced Roman law, appealed to their shared patriotism, and offered concrete proposals for cooperation. He promised amnesty for those who had opposed him, understanding that wholesale purges would drive more men into rebellion. The speech broke the Senate's resolve to resist. They lacked the will to fight 3,000 armed men, and now they lacked the justification. Claudius had given them a way to save face. They voted to ratify his position and voted him the imperial powers. The vote was overwhelming enough to end the immediate crisis. The senators filed out of the chamber, many still shaking their heads at the strangeness of it all. The man they had mocked was now their emperor, and he had outmaneuvered them through a combination of military backing and political brilliance. Claudius immediately fulfilled his end of the bargain with the guard. He promised each guardsman 15,000 sesterces, roughly 15 years of pay, a bonus so generous that it would bind their loyalty absolutely. The money would come from the imperial treasury, replenished by Caligula's confiscations and the wealth of those who had died in the assassination. The payment served multiple purposes. It rewarded the guard for their support, bought their future loyalty, and drained the treasury of funds that might have financed opposition. Claudius also confirmed the prefects in their positions, ensuring that the men who had made him emperor would retain their power. Having secured his military base, Claudius turned to the delicate question of justice. The assassins themselves, led by Cassius Chaerea and Sextus Popinius, could not be allowed to live. Their example might encourage others. Chaerea, the tribune who had struck the first blow, was arrested in the city. He tried to argue that he had acted for the good of Rome, eliminating a tyrant. Claudius listened to the arguments but understood the necessity of discipline. He ordered Chaerea's execution. Several other direct participants in the killing were also put to death. However, Claudius deliberately drew a line between the actual assassins and the broader conspiracy. Men who had known of the plot but not participated directly were left untouched. This included several senators who had been most vocal in opposing his elevation. Claudius understood that a reign beginning with mass executions would be a reign defined by fear and rebellion. He chose mercy for the many to secure his position against the few. One of the most prominent survivors was Valerius Asiaticus, a wealthy senator from Gaul who had been considered a potential emperor himself. Asiaticus had connections, wealth, and military experience. He had initially opposed Claudius's elevation but quickly recognized the reality of the situation. Claudius met with Asiaticus privately in the palace. The conversation was tense. Asiaticus offered his loyalty. Claudius accepted it, appointing Asiaticus to a second consulship later that year. The appointment served notice that competence and conciliation would be rewarded, even in former opponents. It also brought a powerful man inside the tent rather than leaving him outside to plot. Claudius moved quickly to establish his administration. Rather than surrounding himself with aristocratic advisors who had always looked down on him, he turned to the men who had taught him how government actually worked. He appointed Narcissus, his freedman secretary, to manage the imperial correspondence. He made Pallas, another freedman, his financial minister. He elevated Callistus, a former slave, to oversee petitions and the imperial treasury. These appointments scandalized the senators. Rome had never seen freedmen wield such power, but Claudius understood that these men owed him everything. Their loyalty was absolute. Their competence was proven. They had run the empire while Caligula indulged his whims, and they could run it while Claudius learned the mechanics of absolute power. The new emperor also took symbolic actions to distance himself from Caligula's tyranny. He recalled those who had been exiled without cause. He restored some of the traditional privileges of the Senate, though he kept the real power tightly controlled. He cancelled some of Caligula's more outrageous taxes and returned confiscated property where possible. These measures won him goodwill without weakening his position. He also revived the office of censorship, appointing himself to the role, which gave him authority over the membership of the Senate and the conduct of the aristocracy. In February 41 AD, less than a month after his accession, Claudius faced his first potential crisis. The governor of Dalmatia, Marcus Pompeius Silvanus Staberius Flavus, had his legions in a state of readiness. Some feared he might march on Rome to claim the throne. Claudius sent his freedman Narcissus to investigate. Narcissus moved quickly, using the imperial postal system to arrive in Dalmatia before any rebellion could mature. He found no actual plot, just an aging governor who had been confused about his orders. Narcissus returned to Rome with a full report, demonstrating the efficiency of the freedman-run administration. By March 41 AD, Claudius had achieved what seemed impossible. He had gone from hiding behind a curtain to sitting securely on the throne. He had neutralized the Senate through a combination of military pressure and political theater. He had bought the guards' loyalty with gold and kept their commanders in place. He had executed only those who had directly killed Caligula, showing a restraint that surprised those who expected a vengeful reign. He had incorporated potential rivals like Valerius Asiaticus into his government rather than pushing them toward rebellion. And he had established a new administrative system run by men the aristocracy despised, but who served him with absolute devotion. The emperor, who had never commanded a soldier, now commanded the most powerful military force in the world. The man who had been barred from politics now made policy that would shake the empire for decades. The scholar who had been forced to hide his intelligence behind a stammer now deployed that intelligence to outmaneuver Rome's most experienced politicians. 13 years of humiliation and survival had taught Claudius lessons no military academy could provide. He understood power from the bottom up, from the perspective of slaves and soldiers, not just senators and generals. This understanding would define his reign and enable his most ambitious project, the conquest of Britain. But first, Claudius needed to solidify his domestic position and deal with the family connections that had both elevated him and threatened him. His marriage to Messalina, which had seemed a minor political alliance, would soon test his judgment in ways no Senate debate could match. The woman he had married for convenience would nearly destroy his reign through a scandal so brazen it would shock even jaded Roman sensibilities. Claudius had conquered Rome. Conquering his own household would prove far more difficult. Part 3. The Invasion of Britain. By 43 AD, Claudius had spent 2 years shoring up his rule, but a problem remained. He was an emperor without a military triumph, a scholar who had never commanded in battle. The Senate still whispered about his disabilities. The army, while loyal, respected him more for his bonuses than his battlefield prowess. In a society that measured manhood by conquest, Claudius needed a victory. He found his opportunity in the misty islands across the Channel, where Julius Caesar had landed 90 years earlier but had never stayed. Britain, in the early 1st century, was a collection of tribal kingdoms. The most powerful were the Catuvellauni, led by brothers Caratacus and Togodumnus, who had expanded their territory across southern Britain. Roman traders had long visited British shores, exchanging wine and luxury goods for tin and grain. Some southern kings had forged alliances with Rome, accepting nominal friendship in exchange for trade privileges. Among them was Berikos, king of the Atrebates, whose kingdom stretched across southern England. When Caratacus's forces invaded his territory, Berikos fled across the Channel and appealed directly to Claudius in Rome. He offered intelligence, local guides, and a pretext for invasion, restoring a Roman ally and punishing hostile tribes. Claudius seized the opportunity. An invasion would burnish his military credentials, open new trade routes, and provide land for veteran soldiers. He appointed Aulus Plautius, a senator with solid military experience but no political ambitions that could threaten the throne, as commander of the expedition. Plautius was given 4 legions plus auxiliaries and cavalry that brought the total force to roughly 40,000 men. These were not the rawest troops available. Claudius understood that failure would be catastrophic. He also deployed a fleet of transport ships, assembled from ports across Gaul, and loaded them with supplies for a sustained campaign. In early May 43 AD, the army gathered at Gesoriacum, modern-day Boulogne, on the Gallic coast. The legionaries boarded the transports while auxiliaries loaded horses and equipment. They faced a crossing of 100 miles of open sea, a terrifying prospect for men who had never seen water beyond the Mediterranean. Cassius Dio, writing a century later, records that the troops refused to embark, terrified by stories of British savagery and the ocean's dangers. Their officers pleaded and threatened, without success. Finally, Claudius's freedman's secretary, Narcissus, mounted the headquarters platform. This former slave, a man the soldiers had seen running palace errands, addressed the assembled legions. His exact words are lost, but the effect was immediate. The soldiers, shamed into action by a freedman, boarded the ships. The invasion was back on schedule. Plautius's fleet landed at Rutupii, modern Richborough, in Kent, on the southeastern tip of Britain. The landing was unopposed. The British tribes had not expected an invasion of this scale. Caesar's raids had been small, quick affairs. Plautius established a beachhead, unloaded his troops, and sent the fleet back to Gaul for reinforcements. His first objective was to secure the crossing of the river Medway, where Caratacus and Togodumnus had massed their forces. The Battle of the Medway lasted 2 days. Plautius sent a detachment of Batavian auxiliaries across the river at night to take the Britons in the flank. The Batavians, known for their ability to swim across rivers in full armor, executed the maneuver perfectly. The following morning, the legions crossed the river under heavy attack. Legio II Augusta, commanded by the 42-year-old Vespasian, fought its way onto the northern bank and held a bridgehead while the rest of the army crossed. Vespasian distinguished himself in the fighting, leading his men from the front despite a wound to his leg. This campaign would make his reputation and set him on the path to become emperor 16 years later. Caratacus and Togodumnus retreated northward to the River Thames, burning bridges behind them and harrying the Roman advance with chariot attacks. The Thames crossing proved even more difficult. The Britons had fortified the northern bank, and the Romans lacked sufficient boats for a direct assault. For nearly a week, the two armies faced each other across the water. Plautius's scouts searched for a ford while his engineers built makeshift bridging. The delay began to sap morale. Soldiers grumbled about fighting in a land with no clear objectives, far from home. Reports of the stalemate reached Rome by fast courier. Claudius recognized that the campaign needed his personal presence to succeed. He also understood the political necessity of being seen as a conqueror. In late June 43 AD, he gathered a reinforcement column and crossed the Channel himself. His arrival party was spectacular. War elephants, animals few Britons had ever seen, marched down the gangplanks onto British soil. The creatures towered over the legionaries, their tusks sheathed in iron, towers on their backs housing archers. The psychological impact was immediate. Roman troops, heartened by the emperor's presence and these living battering rams, surged forward. British warriors who had faced disciplined legionaries but never these mountain-like beasts with their trumpeting calls, wavered. Claudius brought with him elements of Legio XIV Gemina and substantial reinforcements, bringing the Roman force in Britain to nearly 50,000 men. He took direct command of the final assault on the Thames crossing. The elephants led the way into the water, their bulk creating a living bridge. Archers in the towers cleared the northern bank, while legionaries followed, shields locked, across the makeshift causeway. Togodumnus died in the fighting, struck down by a legionary's sword. Caratacus, realizing the cause was lost, melted away with his warriors into the western hills, beginning a guerrilla campaign that would last another 4 years. With the Thames breached, the path to the Cativaloni capital lay open. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, was the largest settlement in southern Britain, a walled oppidum with a population of several thousand. Claudius led the advance personally, riding in a chariot to save his strength for the ceremonial entry. The Roman column, elephants at its head, marched north through the British countryside, burning villages that resisted and accepting the submission of those that opened their gates. Claudius had issued clear orders: no unnecessary destruction. He needed allies and taxpayers, not a wasteland. On a July morning, 43 AD, the Roman army reached Camalodunum. The town's elders came out to surrender, bearing gifts of grain and livestock. Claudius accepted their submission with formal ceremony, granting them client kingdom status under Roman protection. He stayed in the captured capital for 11 days, receiving delegations from tribes across southern Britain. Kings from the Cantiaci, the Iceni, and the Brigantes traveled to Camalodunum to pledge loyalty. Claudius accepted their oaths, gave them Roman titles, and demanded hostages to ensure good behavior. He established a temple to the imperial cult, a clear signal that this was now Roman territory. After 16 days in Britain, Claudius handed command back to Plautius and returned to Gaul. His work was done. He had achieved what Caesar had not: a permanent Roman presence in Britain. He left behind a governor with clear instructions to consolidate the conquest, build roads and fortresses, and prepare for the long-term administration of the province. Plautius would remain as governor for 2 more years, fighting campaigns in the Midlands and establishing the defensive line that would become the frontier. Claudius's return to Rome was carefully choreographed for maximum political effect. He traveled slowly through Gaul, giving provincial cities time to prepare celebrations. He entered Rome in September 43 AD, riding in a triumphal chariot, wearing the laurel crown of a conquering general. Behind him marched his troops, British chieftains in chains, and displays of captured weapons and standards. The Senate voted him a full triumph, a rare honor for an emperor who had spent less than 3 weeks in the war zone. They also granted him the title Britannicus, which he accepted with feigned modesty. Coins were minted showing Claudius riding in a chariot over a defeated Britain, the legend reading, "Britannicus triumphant." The invasion's military success was real, even if Claudius's personal role in combat was limited. Plautius and his legions had executed a complex amphibious assault and defeated the most powerful British kingdom. Vespasian had proven himself a capable commander, earning decorations and a consulship 5 years later. The province of Britannia, though it would take another 30 years to reach its full extent, was born. Roman legions would remain on British soil for nearly 400 years. The conquest also had immediate human consequences. Caratacus continued his resistance in Wales, fighting a guerrilla war until his final defeat and capture in 47 AD. When he was brought to Rome in chains, Claudius pardoned him, allowing him to live out his life in comfortable exile. The display of clemency toward a worthy enemy enhanced Claudius's reputation for wisdom. Vespasian returned to Rome a hero, his career accelerated by his British victories. He would serve as consul, governor of Africa, and ultimately emperor, founding the Flavian dynasty. For Claudius, the British triumph solved his political problem. No senator could question his legitimacy after a conquest that even Augustus had not achieved. The army saw him as a commander who shared their risks, however briefly. The people of Rome enjoyed games and celebrations funded by British loot. The province itself, though it required constant garrisoning, opened new sources of mineral wealth and agricultural production. The man who stumbled over his words had found his voice through conquest, and the empire he ruled would never be quite the same. Part 4. The Messalina Catastrophe. In 38 AD, when Claudius was still the laughingstock of Caligula's court, he married Valeria Messalina. She was 15 years old, a member of the ancient gens Valeria, and the daughter of his cousin Domitia Lepida. The marriage served political purposes, linking Claudius to a respectable family and providing potential heirs. Messalina was not chosen for her discretion. From the moment Claudius became emperor in 41 AD, she exploited her position with relentless ambition. During the first 7 years of Claudius's reign, Messalina accumulated power through systematic manipulation of imperial patronage. She sold positions in the Senate to men willing to pay enormous bribes. She arranged the executions of rivals by whispering accusations into Claudius's ear when he was tired or distracted. She removed Domitia Lepida, her own mother, from court through a series of orchestrated humiliations. The freedmen who ran the bureaucracy, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, found themselves in constant competition with the empress, who demanded a cut of every major decision. Messalina took lovers with increasing boldness. Early in the reign, she targeted men whose wives had caught Claudius's eye, sleeping with them as petty revenge. She seduced the consul-designate Decimus Valerius Asiaticus, using him to gain information about Senate politics. She took the historian Silius Italicus as a lover, enjoying the scandal of bedding a man famous for his poetry. Claudius either did not know or chose not to know. His attention remained fixed on governing and on his young children, Octavia and Britannicus. By 47 AD, Messalina's attention fixed on Gaius Silius. He was the consul-elect for the following year, a man in his late 30s with a reputation for soldierly virtue and good looks. His wife, Lollia Paulina, had been a candidate for marriage to Caligula, which should have made her untouchable. Messalina did not care. She pursued Silius at public games, sending him notes through slaves, arranging chance meetings in the palace gardens. Silius hesitated at first. Sleeping with the emperor's wife meant death if discovered, but Messalina was persuasive, and Silius was ambitious. The affair began in the summer of 47 AD. Within months, Messalina's feelings for Silius transformed from lust into something more dangerous, a plan to replace Claudius entirely. She began moving assets. She convinced Claudius to give her the house and gardens that had belonged to Lucius Calpurnius Piso, a wealthy noble executed for conspiracy. She transferred ownership of these properties to Silius. She gave him slaves, silver plate, and artworks from the imperial collection. She began telling friends that Silius would make a better emperor, that Claudius was a doddering old fool controlled by his freedmen. She commissioned a genealogy showing Silius's descent from Augustus's rival Sextus Pompeius, giving him a claim, however thin, to legitimacy. The conspiracy took shape in early 48 AD. Claudius planned a trip to Ostia, the port city south of Rome, to deal with a grain shortage that threatened the capital's food supply. He would be away for at least a week, perhaps 2. Messalina saw her opportunity. She told Silius that they should celebrate the Bacchic rites together, a religious festival that involved wild dancing and heavy drinking. More importantly for her purposes, Bacchic celebrations traditionally included symbolic marriages between participants. She proposed that they go further, stage a real marriage ceremony, complete with witnesses, a dowry, and a wedding contract. Silius understood the insanity of the plan. A public marriage to the emperor's wife was treason, punishable by death for both parties. But Messalina argued that Claudius was too blind to see what was happening, that the freedmen were too busy with grain shipments to notice, that their marriage would be seen as a gesture of defiance against a tyrant. Silius allowed ambition to override judgment. He agreed. Messalina moved quickly. She sent invitations to Rome's elite, asking them to attend a private ceremony at the house of Gaius Silius. She hired a flute player and a wedding party. She secured a wedding contract from a compliant notary. She assembled a dowry from properties she had stolen from the imperial treasury. On the appointed day, while Claudius was settling grain disputes in Ostia, Messalina left the palace with a small procession. She wore the traditional wedding veil and dress. She arrived at Silius's house and was welcomed by his household as his bride. The ceremony proceeded exactly as a legal Roman marriage would. Flutes played, guests toasted the couple, the contract was signed. Messalina spent the night with Silius as his wife. The celebration continued for days. Messalina and Silius received guests together as a married couple. Attendees included several senators who congratulated the couple while privately calculating the political implications. Some guests, like the senator Memmius Regulus, left immediately and refused to return. Most stayed, not wanting to offend a woman who could have them killed with a word to her husband. Back at Ostia, Narcissus heard the first rumors from a palace slave who had slipped away to visit family in Rome. The freedman could not believe what he was hearing. He questioned the slave repeatedly, then sent his own agents to investigate. They returned with confirmation. Messalina had married Gaius Silius in a public ceremony. Narcissus obtained the wedding contract and confronted the other freedmen. Pallas and Callistus urged caution. Messalina could still harm them if they moved against her without proof. Narcissus decided to act alone. He traveled to Ostia with the contract and a handful of reliable witnesses, men who had attended the ceremony and could testify under oath. He found Claudius in council with the grain merchants, listening to disputes about shipping quotas. Narcissus asked for a private audience. Claudius, irritated by the interruption, agreed. In a small room overlooking the harbour, Narcissus placed the wedding contract before his master. He explained what Messalina had done, who had attended, how long it had lasted. Claudius's reaction was not rage but confusion. He simply could not process the information. He asked if Messalina was ill, if she had been forced. Narcissus insisted that the marriage was voluntary, public, and ongoing. Claudius continued to hesitate. He asked to see the witnesses. Narcissus had prepared for this. He brought in 2 equestrians who had attended the ceremony, men of unimpeachable status. They described the veiled Messalina, the signed contract, the marital bed. Claudius still seemed uncertain. He asked if perhaps Silius had kidnapped her, if the whole thing was some terrible mistake. At this point, Narcissus abandoned subtlety. He bluntly told Claudius that if he did not act immediately, Silius would be emperor by week's end. He pointed out that the marriage gave Silius control of the imperial house, the treasury, and the loyalty of anyone who feared Messalina. He reminded Claudius that Silius was consul-elect and would soon command legions. The only question now was whether Claudius would act or be acted upon. The words penetrated. Claudius rose from his chair, his face pale. He ordered his litter prepared and called for the Praetorian Guard. He was returning to Rome immediately. Narcissus sent a runner ahead to the palace with instructions to place Messalina under house arrest, but the runner was intercepted by Messalina's agents. When Claudius's litter entered Rome, Messalina was not in the palace. She was in the gardens of Lucullus, a sprawling estate on the Pincian Hill, preparing a defense. She had heard of Claudius's return and understood that discovery was inevitable. She did not flee the city, perhaps believing that her children would protect her, perhaps unable to believe that Claudius would actually kill her. Instead, she went to the gardens where she had spent so many hours planning her intrigues. She gathered her children, Octavia and Britannicus, around her. She wrote a letter to Claudius, not denying the marriage but explaining it as a maneuver to protect him from Silius's ambitions. She sent the letter through a trusted slave. The slave never delivered the message. Narcissus intercepted him at the palace gates, read the letter, and destroyed it. He understood that Messalina still held power over Claudius's affections. A single tearful meeting might undo everything. Narcissus decided to act without further consultation. He went to the Praetorian prefects and told them that Claudius had ordered Messalina's execution. The prefects, who had seen enough imperial scandals to recognize the necessity, dispatched a squad of soldiers to the gardens of Lucullus. The soldiers found Messalina in a pavilion surrounded by her children and a few loyal slaves. The centurion read the order for her death. Messalina begged for an audience with Claudius. She offered money. She threatened revenge. The centurion remained unmoved. He gave her a dagger, the traditional method for a noble suicide. Messalina took the blade, pressed it to her throat, but her hands trembled and she could not complete the act. She tried again, pressing harder, but her nerve failed. The centurion, impatient and disgusted by the delay, drew his own sword and struck. The blow was not clean. Messalina fell, bleeding but alive. A second soldier stepped forward and finished the task with a thrust to her heart. Her body was left where it fell for hours, a deliberate act of shaming. When news reached Claudius, he was eating dinner. He asked if Messalina had been executed. When told yes, he continued eating without comment. He showed no anger, no grief, no relief. He simply returned to his meal. Later that evening, he asked why Messalina was not at dinner. The servants exchanged glances before reminding him that she was dead. Claudius nodded and returned to his wine. The Senate reacted with shock and poorly concealed satisfaction. Many had hated Messalina for her corruption and her interference in their traditional prerogatives. They voted her a damnatio memoriae, an official condemnation that required her name be chiseled from monuments and her birthday removed from calendars. Her property was confiscated and auctioned. Her lovers faced different fates. Silius was arrested immediately and executed without trial. Several senators who had attended the wedding were exiled or forced to commit suicide. Memmius Regulus, who had refused to stay at the ceremony, was praised for his integrity and given a consulship later that year. The freedman emerged from the scandal stronger than before. Narcissus had proven his loyalty beyond question, acting decisively when Claudius faltered. He received honors and additional authority over the treasury. Pallas and Callistus absorbed Messalina's administrative responsibilities, centralizing control of patronage and appointments within their circle. The system Claudius had built on the backs of slave-born bureaucrats now ran without interference from an empress. Claudius himself retreated from domestic politics. He began spending more time with his children, particularly young Britannicus, who at 7 years old was now his only legitimate heir. He also began drinking heavily, a habit that had always been present but now became pronounced. His stammer worsened under stress, making public appearances painful. He relied more than ever on his freedmen to filter information and make decisions. The man who had survived decades of ridicule and 3 years of civil war had been brought low by his own wife. The Messalina catastrophe revealed the central weakness of Claudius's reign. His administrative skill, his military conquest of Britain, his political survival, all were undermined by his inability to see what was happening in his own household. He trusted where he should have suspected, he hesitated where he should have acted, and he required a freedman to save his throne from a teenage empress. The scandal also cleared the board for the next player waiting in the wings, Agrippina, Messalina's cousin and Claudius's own niece, who watched the whole affair with calculation and began planning her own approach to the vulnerable emperor. Within months, Claudius would be married again, this time to a woman whose ambition made Messalina look like an amateur. Agrippina the Younger, daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, and mother of Nero, would bring a new level of dynastic legitimacy to Claudius's bed. She would also bring a son who threatened Britannicus's inheritance and a ruthlessness that would ultimately prove fatal. The man who had survived so much was not done making catastrophic personal decisions. Part 5. Agrippina's poisonous grip. Within months of Messalina's bloody end, Agrippina the Younger began her approach. She was 32 years old in 48 AD, a direct descendant of Augustus through her mother Agrippina the Elder, sister of the murdered Caligula, and daughter of the legendary Germanicus. She possessed what Claudius desperately needed after the Messalina catastrophe: unimpeachable dynastic credentials. She also possessed what Rome feared: a son named Nero, fathered by her deceased husband Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, who at 11 years old could trace his lineage to Augustus on both sides. Agrippina began by visiting Claudius's children. She brought gifts for Octavia and Britannicus, acting the part of a concerned relative. She spoke with Claudius about their shared family history, reminding him of their mutual connection to Germanicus. She was careful never to push too hard. She understood that Claudius, humiliated by Messalina, would be wary of another strong-willed wife. Instead, Agrippina presented herself as a partner, an empress who would restore dignity to the imperial house. Her first major move came through Lucius Vitellius, a consul and close friend of Claudius, who owed Agrippina favors. Vitellius proposed to the Senate that Claudius marry again, arguing that the emperor needed a wife to manage domestic affairs and that Agrippina was the perfect candidate. The proposal shocked the senators. Marriage between uncle and niece violated Roman law and custom. Vitellius argued that the prohibition was outdated, that the gods themselves had sanctioned such unions in myth, that the empire needed stability only Agrippina could provide. He mustered every argument, every threat and bribe at his disposal. The Senate, exhausted by scandal and desperate for calm, voted to change the law. Claudius could marry his niece. Claudius himself needed persuasion. He was 57 years old, increasingly infirm, and still reeling from Messalina's betrayal. He told friends he had no desire to marry again. Agrippina deployed subtle pressure. She arranged for Claudius to see her at public events, always surrounded by supporters, always behaving with perfect propriety. She had her son Nero perform recitations of Claudius's own writings, flattering the emperor's scholarly vanity. She spoke of how she could help manage the burden of government, offering her assistance as a duty to family. By early 49 AD, Claudius relented. He and Agrippina were married in a ceremony that violated tradition but affirmed dynastic continuity. The marriage transformed palace dynamics. Agrippina immediately asserted control over domestic arrangements. She dismissed slaves loyal to Messalina's memory and replaced them with her own trusted freedmen. She took charge of Claudius's wardrobe, his schedule, his diet. She positioned herself beside him at every public appearance, subtly guiding his responses to petitions. She even handled correspondence using her own seal on letters that required imperial attention. The freedmen who had run the empire for Claudius, Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, found themselves dealing with an empress who understood power better than they did. Agrippina's first target was Domitia Lepida, her own aunt and Messalina's mother. Domitia controlled substantial estates and maintained influence among senators who resented Agrippina's rapid ascent. She also had custody of young Britannicus and could claim a stronger connection to Claudius's heir. Agrippina accused Domitia of using magic against the emperor, a charge that terrified Claudius after Messalina's betrayals. She produced witnesses who claimed Domitia had hired sorcerers and made clay images of Claudius for malignant purposes. The prosecution was managed by Agrippina's allies in the Senate. Domitia was convicted and forced to commit suicide in 54 AD. Her estates were confiscated and divided between the imperial treasury and Agrippina's personal accounts. More importantly, Britannicus was now completely under Agrippina's control. With Domitia eliminated, Agrippina turned to securing the succession for Nero. She needed Claudius to formally adopt her son, making him equal to Britannicus in the imperial line. The adoption would require Claudius to renounce his natural son's exclusive claim to the throne, something the emperor had resisted. Agrippina employed multiple strategies. She emphasized Nero's qualifications, his intelligence, his popularity with the people, his blood connection to Augustus. She pointed out that Britannicus, at 8 years old, was too young to rule if Claudius died suddenly. She suggested that Nero could serve as a protector and mentor to his younger stepbrother. Most effectively, she allied with Claudius's freedmen. Pallas, in charge of finances, argued that Nero's adoption would stabilize the succession and reassure provincial governors. Callistus, managing petitions, flooded Claudius with letters from cities across the empire expressing support for Nero. Narcissus, who had saved Claudius from Messalina, was harder to convince. He saw Nero as a threat to Britannicus and opposed the adoption. Agrippina responded by sidelining him, assigning important tasks to other freedmen, and gradually reducing his access to Claudius. In 50 AD, Agrippina achieved her goal. Claudius formally adopted Nero, who was 13 years old. The boy took the name Nero, Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. Britannicus, Claudius's natural son, retained his name but lost his position as sole heir. The adoption ceremony was a public spectacle, with soldiers shouting their approval and the Senate voting honors. Nero addressed the troops, thanking them for their loyalty, while Britannicus stood silently by, a child, rendered politically irrelevant by his father's signature on a piece of parchment. Agrippina did not stop there. She understood that an heir needed not just a name, but an education in power. She recruited Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the famous philosopher and orator, to serve as Nero's tutor. Seneca had been exiled under Claudius in 41 AD, accused of adultery with Caligula's sister, Julia Livilla. Agrippina arranged for his recall and installation in the palace, where he began teaching Nero rhetoric, philosophy, and the principles of governance. Seneca was a brilliant choice. He gave Nero intellectual polish while also owing his career entirely to Agrippina's patronage. For military training, Agrippina selected Sextus Afranius Burrus, a tough but politically astute prefect of the Praetorian Guard. She had Burrus transferred from his post in the provinces to Rome, where he took command of the Guard. Burrus was neither her creature nor her lover. He was a professional soldier who understood that his future depended on the stability of the succession. He saw in Nero a viable emperor and in Agrippina a guarantee of his own position. He accepted the assignment and began drilling the 14-year-old in military matters and the realities of power. By 53 AD, Agrippina had achieved an unprecedented concentration of authority. She controlled the imperial household, managed access to Claudius, directed the education of the heir apparent, and held the loyalty of key freedmen and soldiers. She even appeared on coins, a visual statement that she shared power with Claudius. She attended Senate meetings from behind a curtain, listening to debates and passing notes to Claudius. She received foreign ambassadors and handled correspondence with provincial governors. She was, in effect, co-emperor. Claudius seemed content with this arrangement. His health was declining. He suffered from chronic stomach pains, possibly from ulcers or a more serious condition. His drinking had increased. He spent more time at his villa in Baiae, away from the pressures of Rome. He remained capable of governing, but delegated more decisions to Agrippina and her team. He watched Nero mature into a handsome, intelligent young man, popular with the people, skilled at chariot racing and lyre playing. He saw Britannicus, now 12, growing into a quieter boy, overshadowed by his charismatic stepbrother. Claudius told friends he was pleased with both sons, but he understood that Nero was being prepared for power, while Britannicus was being prepared for obscurity. Agrippina's final move involved removing any remaining obstacles to a smooth succession. She targeted anyone who might support Britannicus in a crisis. She arranged the execution of Lucius Silanus, a young nobleman who had been betrothed to Octavia before Agrippina cancelled the engagement to marry the girl to Nero. She accused Silanus of incest with his sister, a charge that ensured his conviction and suicide. She removed Calpurnius Fabatus, a wealthy knight who had been Britannicus's tutor, by accusing him of plotting against Nero. He was exiled and his estates seized. By 54 AD, the pieces were in place. Nero was 16, married to Octavia, trained by Seneca, protected by Burrus, and adored by the people. Britannicus was 13, isolated, his mother dead, his allies eliminated. Claudius was 63 and visibly failing. The only remaining question was timing. Agrippina could not afford to wait for nature to take its course. Claudius might live for years, and every additional day increased the risk that he might reconsider Nero's adoption, or that Britannicus might develop a political identity. She decided to act. She turned to Locusta, a professional poisoner from Gaul who had been convicted of murder years earlier but kept in imperial custody as a potential asset. Locusta prepared a poison that would work slowly, mimicking natural illness. Agrippina selected mushrooms as the vehicle, knowing Claudius's love of the dish and the difficulty of detecting poison among their natural toxins. On October 12, 54 AD, Claudius attended a family dinner at the palace. The guest list was small. Agrippina, Nero, Britannicus, and a few close associates. The main course was mushrooms, served in a rich sauce. Claudius ate heartily. Within hours, he felt severe abdominal pain. He vomited repeatedly. His doctors, summoned by Agrippina, diagnosed food poisoning from bad mushrooms, a common enough occurrence. Claudius grew weaker over the next 2 days. He could not keep food down. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Agrippina remained by his bedside, managing access, filtering information. She allowed Seneca and Burrus to visit briefly, ensuring they saw the emperor's condition. She did not allow Britannicus any private time with his father. On the second night, when Claudius's condition seemed to stabilize slightly, Agrippina called for the emperor's personal physician, Dr. Gaius Statinius Xenophon. She told him that Claudius was suffering and that a quick end would be merciful. Xenophon, understanding who actually ruled the palace, agreed. He administered a second dose of poison, this time using a feather to force it down Claudius's throat while pretending to induce vomiting. Claudius died within the hour, on October 13, 54 AD. Agrippina moved immediately. She had rehearsed this moment for months. She summoned Burrus and the Praetorian Guard. She presented Nero as the new emperor, noting his adoption, his marriage to Octavia, and his acceptance by the army. The guardsmen, who had been well paid and well treated, shouted their approval. By dawn, Nero was proclaimed emperor by the Senate, which had been convened in the night. Britannicus, asleep in his chambers, woke to find his stepbrother on the throne. Claudius's death was announced as natural. He received a state funeral and was deified by the Senate, though Agrippina made sure no temple was built in his honor. His reign of 13 years ended with a family dinner and a dish of mushrooms. Agrippina had achieved what Messalina could only attempt. She had placed her son on the throne and eliminated anyone who could challenge him. She had done it so smoothly that Rome barely noticed the transition. The woman dismissed as a manipulative wife had proven herself the most effective political operator in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Part 6. Death and Legacy. The emperor's death was confirmed at dawn on October 13, 54 AD. Claudius's chamberlain announced that the emperor had succumbed to natural causes after a brief illness. The official narrative, crafted by Agrippina and delivered to the Senate by the consul-elect, described a painful but inevitable decline. No mention was made of mushrooms, of Locusta, of Dr. Xenophon's feather. The man who had survived Caligula's assassination, outmaneuvered the Senate and conquered Britain, died in his bed. The simplicity of the lie was its strength. Agrippina acted before the body was cold. She summoned Burrus to the palace. The Praetorian prefect found her in the imperial bedroom, Claudius's corpse still on the bed, a wax death mask already being prepared. Agrippina spoke bluntly. Nero must be proclaimed emperor immediately. Any delay risked a counter-move by Britannicus's supporters. Burrus, a soldier who understood the mathematics of power, agreed. He returned to the Praetorian camp and assembled the guard. At sunrise, he presented Nero to the assembled soldiers on the parade ground. The 16-year-old boy, still in his nightclothes, spoke briefly of continuity and stability. The guardsmen, who had profited handsomely under Claudius and had been well prepared by Agrippina's advance work, shouted their acclamation. They pledged their loyalty to Nero and received a donation of 15,000 sesterces each, the same amount Claudius had paid them 13 years earlier. The transaction secured their loyalty as effectively as it had for his predecessor. Meanwhile, Britannicus woke in his chambers to find the palace in motion. Slaves moved quietly, avoiding his eyes. His tutors were absent. When he asked for his father, a chamberlain told him the emperor had died. When he asked to see his mother Agrippina, he was told she was in council with the guard. When he asked what was happening, no one would answer. By mid-morning, he learned from a slave that his stepbrother Nero had been proclaimed emperor and that the Senate was voting its approval. Britannicus was 13 years old. He understood immediately what his adoption had truly meant. He was no longer heir, he was a threat. The Senate, convened in emergency session by the consul, received news of Claudius's death and Nero's proclamation as a single package. There was no time for debate, no opportunity to consider alternatives. Senators who might have supported Britannicus calculated the cost of opposing a guard-backed emperor with Agrippina's ruthless hand on the reins. They voted unanimously to confer imperial powers on Nero. They also voted to deify Claudius, a standard honor that cost them nothing but gave the new dynasty religious legitimacy. Nero addressed the Senate, thanking them for their confidence and promising to rule in the spirit of his predecessor. The speech had been written by Seneca, polished to perfection and delivered without a stammer. Claudius's funeral was held 3 days later, a grand public spectacle that combined imperial pomp with family mourning. His body, preserved in honey and spices, lay in state in the forum. Nero delivered the eulogy, praising Claudius's conquest of Britain and his administrative reforms. He spoke of the emperor's scholarly achievements and his clemency. He did not mention Messalina. He did not dwell on the circumstances of the death. The funeral procession proceeded through Rome to the Campus Martius, where Claudius was cremated on a massive pyre. His ashes were placed in the mausoleum of Augustus, beside those of his brother Germanicus and his nephew Caligula. The man who had been denied public office by Augustus now shared his tomb. The Senate voted to build a temple to the divine Claudius on the Caelian hill. Agrippina vetoed the proposal. She argued that the expense was unnecessary, that Claudius would have preferred his memory honored through public works. The senators understood the real message. Agrippina would not tolerate a permanent monument that might become a rallying point for Britannicus's supporters. A deified Claudius served the dynasty's interests. A temple with priests and rituals might serve his sons. The temple was never built. Britannicus was allowed to live, at first. He remained in the palace, attended his stepbrother at public events, performed the duties of a junior imperial prince, but he was watched constantly. His tutors were replaced by men loyal to Agrippina. His friends were vetted. Every word he spoke was reported. At public games, the crowd cheered Britannicus, remembering his father and showing sympathy for the displaced heir. Nero, watching from the imperial box, smiled and waved, but Burrus noted his expression. Agrippina noted the crowd's loyalty. Britannicus lived on borrowed time. That time ran out in February 55 AD, 4 months after Claudius's death. At a family dinner, Britannicus collapsed, gasping for air, after drinking wine that had been tested publicly by a food taster. The official explanation was epilepsy, a condition that ran in the family. Nero sat at the table, watching his stepbrother die and discussing the weather with his mother. The real cause, later whispered by those in the know, was poison slipped into Britannicus's cup after the taster had approved the wine. The boy was 14 years old. He was cremated quickly, his ashes buried without ceremony. No one was prosecuted. Claudius's legacy is a study in contrasts. Administratively, he was one of Rome's most effective emperors. He elevated freedmen to unprecedented positions, creating a professional bureaucracy that outlasted his dynasty. He expanded the civil service, systematized tax collection, and improved the empire's infrastructure. His conquest of Britain added a province that would remain Roman for nearly 4 centuries, shaping the future of the British Isles. He extended citizenship to Gauls and other provincials, integrating the empire more deeply than ever before. He built aqueducts, roads, and harbors that served Rome for generations. Personally, his reign was a tragedy. He survived Caligula's madness only to be manipulated by his own wives. He conquered Britain but could not control his household. He built an administrative machine of stunning efficiency, but staffed it with men who would help poison him. He created a system that functioned perfectly until he became its victim. The man who stumbled through speeches conquered through competence. The emperor who hid behind a curtain left behind a province. The fool who was mocked for his stammer proved to be one of Rome's most articulate lawmakers. His life demonstrates that intelligence and political skill can exist in forms that power elites fail to recognize. It also demonstrates that personal vulnerability and misplaced trust can undermine the greatest achievements. Claudius died because he could not see the poison in his own house. Rome remembered him because he built an empire that survived his blindness. The paradox defines his life. The scholar who became a conqueror, the survivor who could not survive his own family, the emperor who ruled an empire but never ruled his home. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.